Well, I'll just start by saying it is so much better to humble yourself and be humbled. Am I right? How many times did you show up and get humbled and that was a fun time?
Once.
I love it. Well, my hook for today in this sermon is if you've got the anointing, then you don't need the applause. If you are anointed, you don't need the accolades. And that is sometimes hard for us. And so I'm actually going to just pick up some James here just to kind of ground myself. This is James chapter 3, verse 1. And this is Marilyn Miller's favorite piece of scripture. Not many of you should become teachers, my brothers and sisters, for you know that all who teach face stricter judgment. For all of us make many mistakes, and anyone who makes no mistakes in speaking is mature, able to keep the whole body in check with a bridle. And he goes on to talk about the problems of the tongue and speech. But I like this, not many of you should be considered teachers. Because what happens when we teach content, the same content over and over and over? Well, I think often what happens is we start to identify with the content because we're the bearers of the content. And then we start to believe that we are the content because we happen to know it. We have this information. And because we have this information that maybe other people don't have, now we are the information instead of just the keeper and the sharer of the information. A lot of ministers get tricked into believing that somehow they are keeping the spiritual center of the congregation, that they are the holy ones. And in fact, a lot of congregants in their churches give them that honor and encourage them up those steps because then they get to be the person who's the professionally religious, right? The person whose job it is to be in relationship with God, which is a really hard thing to deal with. And a lot of ministers burn out because they can't handle that pressure, which is unreasonable, right? What I like about what Jesus says about this is this chapter 4, or this verse 4. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on the shoulders of others, but they themselves are unwilling to lift a finger to move them. How many of you have ever worked in a field where we talk a lot about best practices? Yeah? Have you ever encountered best practices that really are completely out of touch with what practice looks like? Right? Like this is the thing that you should do, when in reality there is absolutely no way that you're going to be able to do that. That is just not grounded in how people work, how classrooms are organized, how public service works, where funding comes from. But they've got the degrees and the titles, and they've written the books, and they've authored the articles, and they've given the keynote presentations, and they know, but they don't have any idea. Are we familiar with these folks? It's not necessarily their fault, it's the way that the system is structured to get up the ladder, be the one with the knowledge. So it's not a surprise that Jesus says, respect the people that sit in Moses' seat, because the existence of that seat is valuable. They're the ones that are trying to ground us in our history and our identity. They're trying to teach us the law. If you can't read, this is how you're going to receive it. But just listen to the things, but don't necessarily do what's happening, because they're not really all that consistent on these things.
They've also done a study.
Yes, of course. They've done the study, right? They calculated, they tabulated. Mother Baker says repeatedly that, I didn't mind that there was a man in leadership, that they made sure that it was going to be a minister who was going to be in charge. I didn't mind so long as he was pointing me towards the freedom of my people. It bothered me when he ended up pointing at himself. But what she noticed was the reason often that those leaders pointed at themselves was because institutions are far more interested in making heroes than they are in making change. Institutions are interested in making heroes because those heroes are the figurehead of the institution, and they give legitimacy to the institution. And she knew, and we know, and Jesus taught, that if you are anointed, you don't need the accolades. Now, James says this again in verse 16 of chapter 3. He says, "For where there is envy and selfish ambition, there will also be disorder and wickedness of every kind." I'll just repeat that so that we can hear that really clearly. For where there is envy and selfish ambition, there will also be disorder and wickedness of every kind. But the wisdom from above is first pure and peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without a trace of partiality and hypocrisy. And the fruit of right relationship is sown in peace by those who make peace. See, Jesus is criticizing the Pharisees and the scribes and the establishment and the leadership because they've come to believe that there's something about them intrinsically that makes them worthy of their role and their title, makes them worthy of the best seats at the table, makes them worthy of the honors, makes them worthy of the titles, makes them worthy of the invitation and the free gifts. How many of us have ever thought about how ridiculous it is that millionaires get free stuff all the time? Right? "Oh, you have a bunch of money. Let me pay for this for you." Yeah, I mean, it boggles minds, right? That they get in for free, and the people that can't afford it are the ones that have to pay extra to get in. But Jesus says to us, and we'll pick this up in a couple of weeks, for those who have much, even more will be given to them. And for those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away from them. Again, the difference between prescriptive and descriptive. Jesus is not saying this is how it's supposed to be. He's saying this is how it is. This is how the world works. And we're trying to create a different world. But if we're going to do that, we have to dismantle this idea of leadership. How many of you have ever heard of headman societies? No? Okay, so as an anthropologist, we learn about different ways that communities organize themselves. And for a community that's roughly the size of a church, I mean, not an amphitheater church, but like a church, right? A community church, a neighborhood church, for a communal living group, they're often organized by society in a way that's called a headman society. The way a headman society works is that person looks like they're in charge. That's the person who people go to for advice, people ask questions of, that's the person that can ask for things to happen. But do you know how they actually get their authority? Let's say, for example, that this community is going to welcome another community that's coming, that's sending ambassadors to come and greet. Maybe there's a trading thing that's going to happen. Maybe there's a celebration or something. The headman is the person who gets up first and starts sweeping the common area. And he does that until somebody else looks and sees, "Oh my God, he's sweeping the common area. I can do that." And they come and they say, "Hey, let me have the broom. I can do this." And what does the headman do next? He goes and puts on the coffee. And he puts on the coffee until somebody else says, "Hey, you know what? I can take care of that. Let me do that." And then he moves on to establishing the table. And then he moves on to organize. And it's just like that. They're the one that steps up into the role, does the work, and that people see that that work is being done. And it's not just for that person. It's for the community. And they see to themselves, "Oh, I can do that." There's this kind of law in corporate leadership that says only do what only you can do. Have you ever heard of this before? It's like a rule for CEOs. Only do what only you can do. And the point of it is to keep you from getting distracted by doing stuff that is other people's work. But what it does is it encourages you into this space of specialization where you say, "Well, only I can make $500 million a day, so that's what I'm going to do. And you all can do the actual work of programming. You all can actually do the work of relating. You can do the community outreach. I'm going to do the work of being the CEO." Now, I apologize that I'm being very reductionist and pretty dismissive. And also that's how that often works, right? Part of the work of a headman society, the work of that role, is to help cast that collective vision for who and how are we going to be, not in a way that says you do this, but says, hey, if we're going to do this thing, we have to do all of these things. Now, I'm not great at that, I'll just be honest, and that's one of the reasons that I need other people in the work with me, because I've got like the big picture stuff, but the like practical everyday stuff, I depend on a ton of you to make that shit happen. And so I am grateful to you, and I'm sorry that I'm not here sweeping first. I'm not the best head man I could be, but I'm growing. Mother Baker says that leadership is half listening to people and finding out what they really need and where they want to go, and then half doing. But the doing is about doing a thing that aligns with the listening, because then people see, oh, this person's working on this thing that's in our best interest, our collective interest. This person is helping to move us, and so we will move together. But she says it's 100% equipping. That the work of leading might look like doing some things, and it might look like talking to some people and building relationships, but ultimately it's about encouraging and equipping those folks to do and participate and lead, so that you don't reinforce this, I'm the special one that does the thing, separate from you. It's always about the we, and how do I build up and lead out other people. And Jesus has this same understanding. Don't call anyone else instructor or Lord or Father, for you have one in heaven. And so then the job in the church is to figure out, how do we actually do that? How do we remember that? How do we ground into that? And Miss Baker would say, Mother Baker would say, that we invest in equipping. All of our work of teaching and doing is also about equipping and strengthening. Because if you are anointed, you don't need the accolades. Moving on to chapter 4, verse 11. Do not speak evil against another, brothers and sisters. Whoever speaks evil against another or judges another speaks evil against the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge. There is one lawgiver and judge, who is able to save and to destroy. So who then are you to judge your neighbor? Sometimes we get confused about this, and we let people like the preacher be the one who gets to be the moral arbiter, the one who gets to decide who's right. Not around here, y'all don't give me that responsibility, praise Jesus. But often that's the way that we've grown up. That's the way we've come up in church, is that that's the righteous person who does the thing, and if they're on my side, well, right? And especially if they're the gatekeeper to the resources, then especially you want to get them on your side. You want to make sure that you're in alignment so you can participate. But Jesus is telling us that the way that we're supposed to live is within a flat hierarchy. That somehow we're supposed to understand ourselves as all one and all together. And so why would James say that we're not supposed to judge? Well, because it puts us in the place of God, right? How many times have you had a judgment on somebody and then you found out what was going on in their life, what was happening the 10 minutes before they met with you? The background noise of their relationships and their health concerns and their job and their family and their kids, and then you were like, oh, damn, I came down on you for this? You got humbled, right? We're not supposed to judge because we're supposed to understand that there's always more going on, because there's always more going on in us too. And Jesus is very clear about this point again and again and again and again. So when he says this thing, the greatest among you will be your servant, sometimes we think that means we need to make ourselves smaller. Sometimes we think that that means that we need to be second to other people. But I don't think that's what it means. Go back to the headman example. What it really means is the person who's going to be greatest in your community is the one who's always doing the work that aligns with all of us. Of course they're going to get my respect, because the work they're doing, I can see its value for me and for us. It doesn't mean they're doing stuff that I want to do. It means they're operating in a way that's what we want to do, what we need. And they're a part of we. Ella says that leadership is really about being able to ask people to participate in something out of a relationship, that where they can see their value and see a reason to call themselves into that work. And I think Jesus has the same attitude. So I'll close here with James 5:19. My brothers and sisters, if anyone among you wanders from the truth and is brought back by another, you should know that whoever brings back a sinner from wandering will save the sinner's soul from death and will cover a multitude of sins. That's the end of the book of James. No goodbye, no encouragement, no hope, just this idea that if we welcome people back, that will not only serve that person, it will cover over a multitude of sins. Why would we do that? Not so we can be right. He's very clear that this is not the purpose of it. It's so that we can be whole. In the New Testament, if you ever read the word perfect, you should know that it is always, in Greek, the word teleos, which means complete, fulfilled. We're not called to be perfect, we're called to be whole, to be complete. When we leave people out, when we disenfranchise, when we invest in leadership structures that elevate some over others, we are inherently incomplete. There's been a miseducation. When Ella Baker established the freedom schools in the 60s, she did it for the specific purpose of undoing the miseducation of young Black children. And most of what they had learned in school was that their role was to be second class. Their role was to be subservient. Their role was to accept leadership from others and to not assume that they had any to offer. And the whole system of education conspired together. There was a whole book written on this in the 30s called The Miseducation of the Negro. It was specifically articulating how the system and structure had created this second-class mindset. And the author of that study said, you don't have to control people's behavior. You don't have to tell them what to do if you can control their mind. So what's the work of the church? I draw on this to say that the work of the church is to undo the miseducation that people have in the world about the church, about Jesus Christ. So many of us came from other traditions where we received that miseducation about hierarchy, about domination, about gatekeeping, about access, about who's worthy and who's not, who's closer to God and who's not, and what you have to do to get right with Jesus so that you're something rather than nothing. So many of us were miseducated about this table. So many of us were miseducated about this work, about this role, about this thing, about the man. And I think that today, the work of the church is to redeem the church, to give the church value again, real value. Remember, we talked about redemption last week. Redemption means to give value. I think the work of the church is to redeem the church. And if we're going to redeem the church, we've got to be the church. Half of the work, in my mind, is to build up our own sense of value, of worthiness, to know that we're beloved children of God. Many of us come into church hoping we'll find that, hoping somebody wearing this and speaking into this is going to tell us we're worth something. And sometimes we just need to hear that. We need to hear that because we can't hear it in here, so we got to hear it out here. But the movement is to move it in. How many of you are redeemed? How many of you know you have value? How many of you know that you're worthy and beloved? We are called to be the redeemed, not because we're more valuable, but because we are valuable. And once we start by getting there, getting redeemed, understanding ourselves as redeemed already, we didn't become redeemed, we just realized it, right? Like, oh shit, I have fingernails. I always had fingernails, but I forgot about them. They got real long. I had to clip them because I cut somebody. Anyway, distraction. Then we witness to the redemption of the world. Once we know it, then we can go out and witness to it, to people that don't know that they're redeemed, don't know that they're redeemable, don't know that they have value, don't know that they're loved, don't even know what love is because they've been miseducated by the world. I don't want to say anything.